Every Tuesday before sunrise, another dump truck backed into Nora Vance's dead orchard and raised its steel bed. Then 10 tons of shredded branches slid onto the ground: sycamore, sweet gum, red oak, storm-broken maple. By noon, steam curled from a new mound, taller than the cab. The county called it debris. Nora kept asking for more. What did she believe was hiding inside a field full of broken trees? Nora was 29 when she inherited 53 acres in the Ozark foothills. The place had once been a peach farm. By the time it reached her, half the trees were dead, the irrigation pond leaked, and the soil had hardened into pale plates that rang beneath a shovel. Her uncle told her to sell. A developer offered cash within the month. Nora moved into the farmhouse instead. She brought 2 pairs of work gloves, a second-hand soil probe, and a black notebook she kept in the back pocket of her jeans. The first pages were ugly. Topsoil, less than 3 inches in the upper orchard. Rainfall, 1 8/10 inches. Standing water after 40 minutes. No worms in 3 test holes. The land was not merely tired. It had forgotten how to take anything in. That spring, a windstorm tore through 3 nearby towns. Limbs crushed fences, blocked roads, and filled the county maintenance yard faster than crews could haul them away. The man in charge of the cleanup was Miguel Santos, 56, owner of a small tree service with 6 trucks and nowhere left to dump what his chippers produced. He drove out to Nora's place expecting an argument. He found her kneeling beside a cracked irrigation trench, pressing a clod of soil between her fingers. "I can pay a little," he said. "Just until the county yard clears." Nora looked past him at the truck. "Is that Branchwood or stump grindings?" Miguel frowned. "Mostly branches. Leaves mixed in. Fresh, cut this week." She stood and brushed the dust from her knees. "Bring it here." He nodded with visible relief. Then Nora added, "All of it." Miguel laughed because he thought she was joking. She was not. For 6 weeks the trucks came every Tuesday. The piles spread across the lower orchard like dark islands. They smelled green at first, then sharp, then sweet. On cold mornings they breathed steam into the air. Neighbors slowed down on the county road. Cal Morgan, who ran cattle on the ridge above her, finally stopped his pickup at the fence. "You starting a landfill?" Nora was standing on a ladder with a compost thermometer buried deep in the newest mound. 136 degrees, she said. "That answer my question?" "No." Cal shook his head and drove away. Nora wrote the number down. Pile 3, center temperature, 136. Moisture, high. White fungal growth beginning near the shaded edge. That white growth was what interested her. It appeared in thin threads beneath the surface, then spread into branching webs that bound the chips together. When she lifted a handful, the material sometimes came up in one soft mat. She had seen something like it years earlier beneath a fallen log, but she did not yet understand what it could do for an orchard. The answer came through Dr. Ruth Keller, a retired soil ecologist who lived 15 miles away in a stone house surrounded by walnuts. Ruth had spent 37 years studying what happened underground while farmers watched only what grew above it. At the Saturday market, she noticed Nora buying coffee grounds from a cafe owner who normally threw them away. "What are you feeding?" Ruth asked. Nora opened her notebook. Ruth read 3 pages without speaking. Then she pointed to the sketch of the white threads. "Do you know what those are? Fungus. That is like calling a road gravel." Nora waited. Ruth smiled. "Those threads are carrying dinner through the pile." She explained that young branch wood held more than carbon. Beneath the bark were sugars, minerals, and living tissues a fungal community could reach if the pile had enough air and moisture. The chips were not fertilizer in the usual sense. They were raw structure, a way to build habitat for organisms that could rebuild soil. But Ruth gave her one warning. "Wood rewards patience," she said, "and punishes shortcuts." Nora learned that part first. Her first large windrow was 6 feet high and packed too tightly by a skid steer. 3 weeks later, the center turned slick and sour. When she dug into it, a smell like rotten vinegar rolled across the orchard. The temperature had climbed past 150 degrees, then collapsed. The white threads vanished. Nora wrote it down. Pile 1. Oxygen failure. Too dense. Turned sooner. Her second attempt looked better until July. She had spread the chips in a long, shallow row across full sun. The top dried to gray splinters. The interior followed. By day 11, the fungal web had become brittle dust. Pile 2. Moisture failure. No shade, no recovery. She wrote that down too. Then came the mistake that almost ended the experiment. Nora had read that wood chips could protect soil from heat. She covered half an acre of young cover crop with nearly 8 inches of material that had not finished breaking down. For 2 weeks, the field looked perfect. Then the leaves yellowed. Growth stalled. When she pulled back the chips, the soil underneath was cool but starved near the surface. The living layer was not ready. She had buried the field beneath an unfinished process. By August, the cover crop was nearly gone. So was most of Nora's savings. That night, the developer's offer sat open beside her notebook. The number was enough to clear the farm debt and leave. For the first time, Nora wrote no measurements. She just stared at the page where Ruth had once drawn a simple line. Forest above, forest below. The upper forest was gone. The lower one had never been allowed to return. Nora could sell the land, or she could give the underground forest one more season. She folded the offer and put it in a kitchen drawer. The next morning she began again. This time, she built smaller windrows under the remaining peach trees, 4 feet high, loose enough for air, damp enough that a squeezed handful held together without dripping. She mixed the chipped branches with spoiled hay from cow's barn, poultry litter from a nearby egg farm, and coffee grounds from 2 diners. Every 10 days she checked temperature. Every rain, she tested infiltration. Every month she measured how quickly the chips collapsed. Ruth made her stop thinking in terms of a recipe. Watch the material, she said. The pile will tell you what it lacks. Nora learned the signals. Sharp ammonia meant too much nitrogen. A cold, dry center meant no biological momentum. A black, slimy pocket meant trapped water. An earthy smell meant the pile was becoming something the soil could recognize. By winter, the windrows had shrunk by nearly half. By early spring, the hard chips had softened into dark flakes. The fungal web ran through them like pale stitching. Nora spread the finished material across one test strip no wider than a house. Then she waited. The first change was not dramatic. It was quieter than that. After a 2-inch storm, the treated strip absorbed the water in 9 minutes. The bare row beside it still held puddles after an hour. 3 weeks later, she pushed a soil probe into both rows. The untreated ground stopped it at 4 inches. The treated ground took the probe nearly 10. She dug 1 shovel from each. The first held 2 earthworms. The second held 17. Nora counted twice. Then she sat down in the mud and laughed. The soil had not become rich overnight. It had become willing. That was enough. She expanded slowly, 1 acre, then 3. She stopped burying living plants beneath raw chips. Fresh material went on paths, around established trees, or into managed piles. Finished fungal compost went where roots needed help. The old orchard became her laboratory. She recorded moisture at 6-inch depth. She compared shaded rows with exposed rows. She tracked which woods broke down quickly and which held structure longer. Willow and maple softened first. Oak lasted. Cedar was kept separate. Miguel began marking loads before they left his yard. Mostly oak. Storm maple. Mixed brush with leaves. What had once been dumped without a thought now arrived with a label. Then the drought came. It began with a dry April and tightened through June. By July, ponds around the county had pulled away from their banks. Cows' pasture browned from the ridge down. The county limited water use. Nora's upper orchard faded. But the rebuilt rows stayed green. At 6 inches, treated soil still held moisture 4 days after the last irrigation. The untreated rows dried hard by the second afternoon. Young pear trees in the test block kept pushing leaves. Pumpkins under the fungal mulch stayed cool enough to flower. Nora did not celebrate. She kept measuring because drought had a way of punishing confidence. Then August arrived with another month of heat. The green rows held. One evening, Cal came down from the ridge and stood beside the fence without making a joke. He pulled off his cap. How much of that stuff would it take to try 5 acres? Nora looked at his pasture. More than you want. Will it work? Not fast. Cal nodded. Fast has not worked either. That autumn, they began rebuilding a strip along his most eroded slope. The work spread from there, not because Nora advertised, because water behaved differently on the fields she treated. A school garden survived a hot summer with half its usual irrigation. A berry grower cut erosion below his rows. A small cattle farm restored grass on ground that had once shed rain like a roof. The county extension agent came to review Nora's records and stayed for 4 hours. By then, her black notebook had become 6 notebooks. 3 years of temperatures, rain events, worm counts, infiltration times, wood species, failures circled in red. What convinced people was not the steam rising from the piles. It was the proof under their boots. Miguel stopped paying landfill fees on nearly all his clean branch material. Nora began charging only for processing and delivery. She called the operation Understory Soil Company because the real work, she said, happened below the part people noticed. It never became a giant factory. That was not the point. It became a network. Tree crews brought clean chipped branches. Farms supplied manure and spoiled hay. Cafes saved grounds. Nora turned those waste streams into soil blends, orchard mulch and fungal compost tailored to different fields. Over 6 years, more than 20 local farms used material from her windrows. The old peach property changed with them. The leaking pond was repaired and ringed with native grasses. New fruit trees replaced the dead ones. Wildflowers returned to the lower slope. After heavy rain, the creek ran clearer because less soil left the farm. And the field where the first trucks had dumped storm debris no longer looked like a dumping ground. It looked alive. Nora still carried a notebook. The newest one was blue. But the first black book stayed on a shelf in the farmhouse. Its opening page held 4 lines. Less than 3 inches of topsoil. Standing water after 40 minutes. No worms. Land forgot how to take anything in. On the final page, years later, she wrote 4 more. Topsoil deepening. Rain absorbed. Worms abundant. Land learning again. The county had delivered broken trees. Fungi turned them into passageways. Roots turned those passageways into shelter for water. And a farm everyone had written off began producing something more valuable than a crop. It began producing soil. The town had dropped off debris. The earth read it as a future.